y'all, Scott here, and step right up to the Birth Off, where we fuse illegal gambling and pregnant women. Which pregnant woman will squirt one out first? Place your bets and let's find out.
I have been ordered to issue an apology by the court of law. In no instant should childbirth be linked to illegal gambling. And if there's one thing that makes childbirth a drag, it's illegal gambling. Please forgive me and don't set up a child birth off of your own. I must now stay at least 50 feet away from any pregnant woman and must complete 14 minutes of community service by informing the public on a much less problematic topic. Game console births and the titles that come with them. Shit, that's it? You can't have a game console without some games, so obviously you gotta launch with them. However, that's easier said than done. It's definitely tricky dicky to land on a date where you must have hardware and a football field's worth of software ready at the same time. So usually one or the other or both are totally half-baked. So let's gander at console launches in days of yore and see how gross, lame, or surprisingly good they were. All of these will be North American launch titles and physical releases only. I'll be ranking them based on how good I think the launches were, taking into consideration the quantity, quality, and sheer variety of games available. And yes, before you ask, I'll address the rumor. I'll be using my patented 6-point scale and rate them as a whole. The Nintendo Entertainment System launched on October 18th, 1985 here in North America alongside 17 games in these slick black boxes. It seemed that Nintendo strived to offer variety at the launch of the NES with everything from sports games, arcade games, action games, light gun games, the whole 9 yards. Of course, nowadays I'd say a solid majority of these games haven't held up too awful well. I mean, I swear I've heard during Pearl Harbor soldiers could hear the term 10-yard fight ringing in their ears. Some of these aren't too great, but with gems like Duck Hunt, Excite Bike, Kung Fu, and of course Super Mario Bros., it's hard not to appreciate the launch titles of the NES and admit that back in '85, this was a pretty solid lineup. The Sega Master System launched in September of 1986 with 2 games. See you later. The Game Boy launched on August 11th, 1989, and we'll take the NES launch titles and cut them in half. And then cut them in half again. The Game Boy launched with some very basic sports titles: Alleyway, an Arkanoid clone, Super Mario Land, a jank yet charming portable Mario game, and Tetris. Need I say more? Disregarding any other titles that launched alongside it, you had Tetris and Super Mario Land, the only 2 titles the Game Boy had to launch with, so the launch was decent enough. I think it was pretty solid, but could have used a few more titles and recognizable franchises. The Sega Genesis launched on August 14th, 1989, and this is definitely an improvement compared to the Master System. This lineup really felt like they were trying to highlight how the Genesis can perfectly recreate an arcade experience with titles like Altered Beast and a sequel to the arcade title Space Harrier. You also have Tommy Lasorda Baseball if that's your thing. Overall, not a mind-blowing launch, but one with a few quality titles at the time and enough variety to get a pass. The Game Gear launched in April of 1991 with this sack of games, and not doing much for me. All these are ports of Sega Master System games, which makes sense because the Game Gear is fundamentally just a repackaged Master System, but still, you look at the Game Boy and it had Tetris, which hadn't released on the NES yet, and Super Mario Land, major system-selling exclusives. The Game Gear didn't have that big exclusive title really, so while this was a decent lineup of games, it honestly isn't the most compelling. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System launched on August 23rd, 1991, and crack open your quality containers and make room for 5 titles, because I gotta say, with the NES's overabundance of games at launch, the SNES definitely took strides to focus on quality and variety. 5 great games, all completely different genres. If I could ask for more, I'd say a few more titles would do it, but overall, this is a superb launch lineup. The Sega Saturn launched on May 11th, 1995, and whoa Nelly, what a botched launch. Sega was supposed to launch the Saturn in the holiday of 1995, but instead they decided to shoot the launch up to May of that year, and yikes, games like Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter simply weren't ready for launch, and Clockwork Knight, Worldwide Soccer, and Pebble Beach Golf Links ain't nothing special, that's for sure. The standout title of the bunch is definitely Panzer Dragoon, but even that couldn't save how botched this launch was. It basically killed Sega. The PlayStation launched on September 9th, 1995, and my oh my, some solid variety and quality. Ridge Racer, Rayman, Battle Arena Toshinden, The Raiden Project, NBA Jam, the list goes on. Nothing crazy, but definitely some decent stuff. And you're gonna have to excuse me on this one. I was never a PS1 guy at all, but from what I know, this was pretty solid. The Nintendo 64 launched on September 29th, 1996, and this is embarrassing. Nintendo home console launches just got smaller and smaller until blam, 2-title launch event, have at it. Mario 64 and Pilot Wing 64. Sure, one is the most revolutionary games of all time and the other is Mario 64, but my god, only 2 titles? Not a lot of variety here at all. If these 2 titles weren't as quality as they were, we'd have a bit of an issue here. Alas, these are 2 very decent games to launch with, and in many folks' cases, Mario 64 is the only one they ever needed. But you have to admit, the launch could have had a few more titles. The Game Boy Color launched on November 19th, 1998, and cough cough, this is anemic. Tetris DX, it's Tetris, but in color, hooray, what a revolution. Game & Watch Gallery 2, it's a bunch of LCD Game & Watch games remade on the Game Boy Color. Egads, a revolution is upon us. Pocket Bomberman, a new Bomberman game, eh? Does somebody smell a revolution? Centipede. It's fucking Centipede. The Game Boy Color has got to have one of the lamest launches ever. Yeah, these are all solid games, but these in no way give you a reason to pick up a Game Boy Color if you already have a Game Boy. Plus, these are all games that are like way past old or very, very similar to older games. Why no new titles? The Sega Dreamcast launched on September 9th, 1999, and this is how you do a console launch. Sega learned their lesson from the Saturn and crammed as much quality as they could into the Dreamcast's big day. So much variety, loads of games, and so many quality titles. Sonic Adventure, Sonic's big foray into 3D, was a smash success and great game at the time. Soul Calibur, an amazing 3D fighting game. Power Stone, a spectacular multiplayer party fighter. House of the Dead 2 and Hydro Thunder, great arcade games. The Dreamcast had a pretty banging launch to say the least. The PlayStation 2 launched on October 26, 2000, and similar to the PlayStation 1, the PS2 saw a multitude of games with a load of variety within the genres. Nothing absolutely insane or anything considered system sellers, but if you were to buy the console at launch, there was enough here to keep you occupied. The Game Boy Advance launched on June 11th, 2001, and you know what? Not bad. Games like Castlevania Circle of the Moon, Choo Choo Rocket, F-Zero Maximum Velocity, Konami Crazy Racers, and Super Mario Advance? Excellent way to start off the handheld. There's loads of high quality stuff here, lots of variety, and the only thing I'm a little miffed about is the lack of original Nintendo games. We have 2, being Mario Advance and F-Zero Maximum Velocity, and Mario Advance was simply a remake of Super Mario Bros. 2, even though it was still really solid. I think at least one more game would have made this an even better launch. The Xbox launched on November 15th, 2001, and Microsoft did a really solid job on their first outing in the console market. Halo, Oddworld, Munch's Odyssey, Project Gotham Racing, Fusion Frenzy, all at launch, that's pretty solid, including stuff like Cell Damage, Dead or Alive 3, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X. It's a bit oversaturated with sports games, but for a first console, this was a pretty solid launch. The GameCube launched on November 18th, 2001, and man, this was a tough one. Was it pretty good or relatively meh-worthy? Titles like Luigi's Mansion and Wave Race Blue Storm are cool to have, but not everybody's cup of tea. Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 looks amazing for a GameCube game and is pretty beloved, and Super Monkey Ball is an all-around stellar title, with Crazy Taxi and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 there as well. But really, that's about it. Not a ton of stuff, but a fair amount of quality. Also, Smash Bros. Melee and Pikmin launched on the system like a week later, so not bad, I'd even say pretty good. The Nintendo DS launched on November 21st, 2004, and oh god, this is pretty bad, I gotta say. The only thing here that's really all that noteworthy is Super Mario 64 DS, and even then, that game was only made as a way to show everybody that the DS can play 3D games. The game is fine, it works, but it's not the most comfortable way to play Super Mario 64. I have to admit it was impressive at the time, though. We also had Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt, a demo of Metroid Prime Hunters. And who could forget Ping Pals and Feel the Magic This Blows? The PlayStation Portable launched on March 24th, 2005, and similar to the PS1, you're gonna have to excuse me, I've never gotten too acquainted with the PSP, even though I'd love to. But from what I can tell, the PSP had a pretty decent launch. We have some solid franchises like Ape Escape, Twisted Metal, with an appearance from Wipeout, with kinda ho-hum third-party support in my opinion.
The Xbox 360 launched on November 22nd, 2005 with a lineup not as solid as the original Xbox's. The original Xbox launched with Halo, the Xbox 360 launched with Perfect Dark Zero, a less than stellar successor to the Nintendo 64 game. I mean, you have stuff like Project Gotham Racing 3, Cameo, Condemned, and Ridge Racer 6, but overall there really wasn't much of a heavy hitter, that one game you need the system for. I guess Microsoft thought that would have been Perfect Dark Zero, but that just refused to happen. The PlayStation 3 launched on November 17th, 2006, and if you don't remember, the PS3 had a bit of a rough start, and good God, it's easy to see why. There's nothing here. Well, we have Ridge Racer and Resistance? Genji Days of the Blade, anybody? Resistance is definitely the closest to being a system seller, but even then, it's just alright. The Wii launched on November 19th, 2006, and wow, Zelda at launch? The return of the Excite series of games with Excite Truck? Wii Sports? What a lineup! Oh, and there's like 20 other games that are garbage. That's a bit on the harsh side of things. Trauma Center Second Opinion is cool. The third-party offerings at the Wii's launch were pretty bad to say the least. A bunch of licensed games, multiplats that really didn't know how to use the Wii Remote. If it weren't for the Nintendo games, I'd be singing a different tune. I mean, Nintendo delivered what many can't at a launch. Must-have system sellers in the form of Zelda Twilight Princess and Wii Sports. I love this launch, but simply due to the sheer amount of garbage here, I'm going straight down the middle with the rating. The Nintendo 3DS launched on March 27th, 2011, and no thank you. The 3DS launch was notoriously pretty bad. Nothing here had much substance. Super Street Fighter 4 3D Edition was definitely the most talked about game at launch. I mean, it was Super Street Fighter 4 on a handheld, that was pretty impressive. Rayman 3D was a gross port of Rayman 2 from 1999. Asphalt 3D was a port of a free mobile game for $40. Everything else was just kinda there, nothing absolutely horrible, nothing great. Nintendo's offerings were just as sparse. Nintendogs plus Cats really was everything the title made it out to be. Nintendogs with cats. Steel Diver was a slow-paced submarine sim, which was really an either you like it or you hate it type of game. And Pilot Wings Resort was the one I was most into, but like the rest of the titles, there just wasn't enough to it. This launch had a load of quantity, but nothing to keep you coming back to the system. These all felt like filler titles. The PlayStation Vita launched on February 22nd, 2012, and guys, I gotta be honest. Even though the PS Vita flopped hard, it had a great launch lineup. Sony really hit it out of the park with their exclusives, Hot Shots Golf, Wipeout, Mod Nation Racers, Uncharted, and the third-party offerings weren't too bad either. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Blaze Blue, Rayman Origin, Touch My Katamari. Now, the problem is many people would rather play these types of games on a TV, and these games were already basically watered-down console games, so the Vita struggled throughout its life. But I gotta say, the launch of this system was better than most Sony consoles. The Wii U launched on November 18th, 2012, and, well, that's an improvement from the 3DS. There is a fair amount of variety in the Wii U's launch. The problem was the majority of these games were either too old for people to really care at that point, or had better versions elsewhere. Nintendo supplied games like Nintendo Land, a really fun minigame compilation that was sadly nowhere near as effective as Wii Sports was, and New Super Mario Bros. U, a solid game, but way too similar to New Super Mario Bros. Wii on the previous console. Definitely not helping out in terms of differentiating the Wii U from the Wii. They also published a few titles, being Ninja Gaiden 3, Razor's Edge, and Sing Party, but overall, the launch wasn't exciting at all, really. And the games that originally did excite people, like the exclusive title Zombie U, ended up garnering a mixed reception. PlayStation 4 launched on November 15th, 2013, and oh man, I'm not a fan of this lineup. Do you like games that were also available on the previous generation of PlayStation, also available on the Xbox One, and exclusives that are trash? Well, you already have a PS4, so what's the point in selling one to you? The Xbox One launched on November 22nd, 2013 with an alright string of games. Better than the PS4's offerings, I gotta say. The Xbox One actually had some exclusives like Dead Rising 3, and that's about it, but at least that's better than all of the PS4 launch exclusives combined. Rise Son of Rome was seen as a bit of a disappointment for loads of QuickTime events, and Zoo Tycoon made an appearance, which is pretty solid. Better than the PS4's launch, but still far from amazing. The Nintendo Switch launched on March 3rd, 2017, and this one is a bit hard to rate. I mean, only 5 retail games were available at launch, and they either appeal to Nintendo fans or casual gamers. Zelda Breath of the Wild is a game that many will consistently wag their finger at and say, oh boy, that game, but it was also available on Wii U that exact day. Didn't really matter much because who owns a Wii U, but it definitely took away a bit from the feeling of having Zelda at launch. At least with Zelda Twilight Princess on the Wii, that was exclusive to the Wii for a few weeks before making its way to the GameCube. Super Bomberman R is a Bomberman game. game, there's no doubt about that. 1-2 Switch is pretty fun for the first hour you play, and for God's sakes, never again. And Just Dance and Skylanders, the pinnacle of any system launch. Downloadable titles fared a bit better with games like Snipper Clips and Fast RMX. Overall, without Zelda, I'd definitely be having traumatic flashbacks about this launch, but a new Zelda title definitely goes a long way and made the Switch's launch pretty great. However, gotta dock points for the lack of quantity. So overall, most launches kinda blow, but what really matters is a steady stream of games afterwards. The launch shouldn't be the be-all end-all of a system, it's just warming up at that point. However, launches do matter because first impressions matter. It sets a standard, it shows you what you've gotten yourself into. The launch of a system is only the beginning, and hopefully means it can only get better from there. But if console manufacturers actually want people to buy their systems in drove at launch, well, they better release it with some pretty stellar games.
Well, that was definitely community service, and 14 minutes of it. Anyways, I have places to do and things to be. I think I'm gonna go heckle some dogs at the pound. It's gonna be hilarious. When will I ever learn?